All right, well, by my clock, it is 9:10, so we'll get started. So thank you all for being here. My name is Jamil Jaffer. I'm the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason University Antonin Scalia Law School. We are taping this event today, so this event will be available on the internet, on YouTube, for all of our viewers out there who can't make it because they're caught up in the ultimate vote on the debt ceiling and the budget cuts that go along with it to hopefully bring our economy into more stable order. I'm thrilled today to be joined by a distinguished panel to talk about the new axis of evil, how the alignment of global repressors is dangerous for the United States. To my immediate right is Bonnie Glick. Bonnie served as the Deputy Administrator for the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, from 2019 to 2020. She began her career as an American diplomat, served for a dozen years as a Foreign Service Officer at the U.S. Department of State. She later worked for IBM as a global account executive. She co-authored 3 patents as part of IBM research. She also served as Deputy Secretary of the Maryland Department of Aging from 2017 until 2019 under Governor Larry Hogan. In her role as Deputy Administrator of USAID, Bonnie served as the Chief Operating Officer of the department and ran a number of task forces and led a number of councils. She speaks 7 languages, including English, Spanish, Portuguese, Hebrew, Amharic, French, and Russian. She's a BA in Government International Relations from Cornell, an MA in International Affairs from Columbia, and an MBA, as if that wasn't enough, from the University of Maryland. So Bonnie, thrilled to have you with us. To her immediate right is Dr. Christopher Ford. Dr. Ford is a visiting fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and a visiting professor in the Graduate Department of Defense and Strategic Studies at Missouri State. Additionally, Dr. Ford serves as a non-resident senior fellow at Lawrence Livermore, as a member of the advisory board of the Vanderbilt Coalition, as a distinguished fellow, and on the advisory board of NSI at George Mason. From 2018 until 2021, Dr. Ford served as Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation, and also exercised the authorities, although didn't have the job completely, of Under Secretary for Arms Control and International Security from October 2019 until his resignation from the Department of State on January 8, 2021. We'll leave that alone. Before his service at the State Department, Dr. Ford served as a special assistant to the President and Senior Director for Weapons of Mass Destruction and Counterproliferation at the National Security Council, and had previously served on the staffs of, wait for it, the U.S. Senate's Foreign Relations, Banking, Appropriations, Intelligence, Investigations, and Government Affairs Committees. He also served previously in the State Department in a variety of roles and was an intelligence officer in the U.S. Navy Reserves. Dr. Ford is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, IISS, the Royal Institute, and the American Society of International Law. Thanks for being here, Chris. And last but certainly not least is Ambassador Paula Dobriansky. She's a senior fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center at Harvard and vice chair of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Ambassador Dobriansky has previously served in a variety of high-level roles in the government, including Under Secretary of State for Global Affairs, President's Envoy to Northern Ireland, NSC Director for European and Soviet Affairs, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. In addition to roles in the public sector, she was SVP and Global Head of Government and Regulatory Affairs at Thomson Reuters and held the Distinguished National Security Chair at the U.S. Naval Academy. A member of the Council on Foreign Relations as well and the American Academy of Diplomacy, Ambassador Dobriansky has served on the Defense Policy Board, the Secretary of State's Foreign Policy Board, and is chair of Exim Bank's Council on China Competition. Ambassador Dobriansky holds a BSFS, summa cum laude from Georgetown, and a PhD in Soviet political and military affairs from Harvard. Ambassador Dobriansky, it's great to have you with us as well.
Thank you, and I'm going to add one thing because you're George Mason, and that is I was on the board of visitors of George Mason University.
And we appreciate your service.
Governor George Allen's
wonderful. Well, we all remember Senator Allen and Governor Allen well, and so we're thrilled to have you all with us. And today we'll be talking about what we see as a potential new axis of evil. So I want to jump right into it, and I'll start with you, Bonnie. We're talking about these new globally repressive regimes, right? These are nations that repress their own people and are expanding their circle of repression either through the distribution of technology or distribution of capabilities or simply debt diplomacy and other methodologies around the globe. But what I'm interested in is less about what they're individually doing, but what are they doing together? What are Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, how are they collaborating, and how concerned should we be about some of these collaborations taking place?
So thank you, Jamil. That was a great introduction to the conversation that we're having today. And one of the things that I want to point out about this new axis of evil is just a question on that term. Is it really new? And you'll remember that President Reagan referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire.
Right.
And President Bush, 43, referred to Iran, Iraq, and North Korea as the axis of evil. Missing from this conversation is China, of our previous presidents, but I think under President Trump and continuing under President Biden, we have a very clear indication that China is our closest peer rival. I call it a near peer. In this world order that we're in today. The collaboration amongst these global bad guys is something that we really do have to be aware to. We have to be attuned to it, but it's not overly new. So when you think about where the world is today versus where the world was when Paula and I were students of the Soviet Union, in the Cold War, the world was broken down pretty neatly into client states of the Soviet Union and allies of the United States. The landscape is grayer now, and that has to do a lot with China and technology. And so ultimately, and then I'll pass it to my colleagues, ultimately I think the landscape has changed because of the diffusion of different forms of technology. And by China being much more closely entangled, particularly economically, with countries all over the world, such that...
Including us,
such that it becomes very difficult to point a finger and say, China is bad because the implication is that China could cut your country off economically. Including the United States.
Yeah.
We've started to take steps to decouple or at least de-risk the relationships with China, and we'll move forward from that.
Yeah. So Chris, you focused for a large portion of your career on non-proliferation issues. And one of the things that we've seen historically, to Bonnie's point about some of this isn't new, is that relationship between Iran and North Korea when it comes to potentially nuclear weapons, but certainly when it comes to ballistic missiles. Talk to us about that relationship and how that relationship has evolved or changed over time, what it looks like today, and what it might tell us about this new relationship we see budding. But well, I guess there's a historical relationship between Russia and Iran, but the new budding relationship with Iran sending weapons to Russia instead of the other way around, and Russia sending U.S.-made weapons that they're acquiring on the battlefield to Iran, presumably for copying or the like. So talk to us about those two particular dynamics.
Well, it's certainly the case. As Bonnie mentioned, some of this kind of cooperation in the more advanced technology arena, unfortunately, that isn't new either, right?
Right.
It has always been, especially given the degree to which cutting-edge technology and often weapons of mass destruction can be kind of tools of asymmetric advantage. That is something that it has always, but for a long time, been thought useful, certain regimes wanting to upset the international order, wanting to posture themselves against the United States and its allies and partners and friends. It's always been sort of an attractive potential gambit to play, right? Going all the way back to the Soviets, who wanted to build up the Chinese, a fellow communist dictatorship that hated the capitalist democracies of the West,
right.
And it was a choice of the Soviet Union to help China build its nuclear weapons program in the 1950s. They trained Chinese scientists, they provided weapons technology, they almost provided a prototype nuclear weapon, although Nikita Khrushchev, I think, got cold feet about that at the last minute. But that was sort of like the round one. Let's go build. The enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. So we're going to use these tools of asymmetric advantage to build up those who don't like people we don't like.
We did the same thing.
Oh, sure. Well, weapons of mass destruction is a little bit more challenging. We
Fair.
were more on the defensive, whereas that was more of an offensive posture, I would argue. But you see China then paying this forward, right, with Pakistan, for example, causing challenges for its rival on its southern border, India, and then Pakistan, of course, and that included a weapons design, by the way, and that weapons design, among other things, was also paid forward by Pakistan to certain recipients through AQ Khan in portions of the Muslim world. So Yes, this is not new. And is this sort of thing continuing? Well, I hope it's not continuing with respect to WMD, and I've not seen evidence of that. But it is continuing with other aspects of advanced technology. You're seeing that, as you mentioned, with Iranian drones helping the Russians go commit war crimes in Ukraine. You may see technology flow back the other direction, not just US kit, right? But there are lots of things that the Russians, at least before the Ukraine war, I mean, even Russians apparently felt a degree of shame, which is kind of remarkable at this point in world history, but for a while they were not willing to go whole hog in supporting the Iranian regime with arms. That is presumably much less true now. So this is, unfortunately, a very old gambit, but it is one that is very much being played. And one that we have to be worrying about because it's enormously challenging.
So, Paula, what about this China-Russia tie-up? Right before the Ukraine war got hot or hotter, I guess, and the Russians formally crossed the border. We had the announcement of this no limits partnership. Nobody really knew what that meant, and at some level, it's played out a little bit. We've seen supplies to the Russians, but not of actual weaponry, as far as we know, right? Not publicly, at least, but helmets and the like, equipment. But we've also seen, this building relationship. We saw President Xi and President Putin get together. We heard that very public conversation with President Xi making a point in public in front of the cameras to say to President Putin, there are changes going on in this world, the likes of which haven't been seen in 3 decades, and we, the Russians and the Chinese, are shaping those changes. What does that all mean? Is this a real relationship, a real alliance? And if so, what's the nature of it, and what should we think about it?
All right. Well, first on what's new and not so new. The relationship between Russia and China, I would say, is not so new.
Right.
Although it is worth noting that historically, Russia and China have had in their history periods of extreme tensions. I would say that there are times where there was no love lost and there was conflict. Having said that, though, it's not so new in terms of this collaboration. But I would say in your title, what is new is the intensity and the scale and the scope of that relationship. What is it that joins China and Russia together at this time? And it's important, I think, to say this and to step back geopolitically. What it is, they have a common goal and a common mission, and that is to literally diminish, if not eradicate, U.S. power and influence internationally. They're joined in that mission, that effort. And then secondly, they're also joined in the effort of trying to fragment our own alliances and partnerships. We've seen this extensively in terms of their outreach, engagement, the Russian influence, weaponization of energy in Europe, of course, the Chinese in terms of One Belt, One Road, and their attempt, not just only with Europe, but when you look at their investments, substantial investments in Latin America, Africa, strategic minerals, but that's what joins them. So what's new, by the way, is the intensity of the relationship. Most analysts will say, but hey, when you look at the relationship between Russia and China, by the way, the extent to which Putin and Xi Jinping have met, I think now the number is something like in the range of between 40 to 50 times. That personal kind of relationship, you don't see that in the past. So that is new and distinctive, in this case politically. If I could also just add, what's also rather new is the scale in which the Chinese are collaborating in the Russian military exercises. They've had a number of exercises. There was the big East one and the big West one, and the Chinese came in. They, brought in and were part of that exercise. Interestingly enough, most recently, Iran was also part of an exercise. That's a rather new, a bit of a new element. But then, if I may mention 2 more to respond to you and then conclude, the 2 other pieces, if you look at economically, my gosh, in terms of the level of the economic activity, and especially because of sanctions now with Ukraine, it has really gone up extensively. China has provided a kind of market and an out for Russia during this period. China is, even though it says, it's not engaging, it is,
Right.
because basically it's providing absolutely for Russia capital which it's using for war fighting. And then let me also just add here, it's not only economically but militarily.
Yeah.
In terms of what the Russians have been providing the Chinese have really scaled up in terms of their naval posture and no less their overall defenses.
Yeah.
So final point, when people debate this question, how would you define it? Is it a marriage of convenience? I would say no. It's much more than that. Is it a real alliance? I would say that, and you use the term, of course, they use the term no
Right.
limits. I would say that it borders on that, but there are real limits.
Right.
They are competitive, like the
Yeah.
Arctic. There's competition
Right.
there. There are certain domains where there's competition. So the term that I would actually use is alignment. They have a very,
Alignment.
very strong, close alignment.
Yeah. So, Chris, about this alignment that Ambassador Dobriansky talks about, talk to us about how do you see the same way, in particular on the goals that she talks about, right? The idea that their goal, this alliance, is to minimize U.S. influence globally. One, do you agree that that's the goal? And if that is the goal, how successful have they been at that? I mean, we've been
Fragment our alliances too.
Right, in fact,
As I said,
alliances, right,
spoke,
agreed.
okay?
Well, I'm interested in the first part. I want to talk about the second part too, but let's on the first part. Do we think that's one of their two key goals? And if so, how well are they doing it? I'd love both you and Bonnie to answer that if you'd mind.
Sure. Well, I think it's an accurate characterization. I think they very much share. Alignment is a great term. They share an interest in diminishing our power and role in the world.
Yeah.
They share an interest in separating us from our partnership relationships and our alliance relationships, in part so that they can have their way with the countries that we would otherwise be protecting, who are in many cases often their neighbors. Indeed, it's quite the other way around. To some degree, these people are in fact our allies precisely because of the threats presented by these governments.
See Finland and Sweden.
For example.
And Vietnam.
And
Vietnam.
Lots of folks. So that they share an interest on. Do they have a fundamental long-term alliance of interests? I would argue, at least in the Russia-China case, no, but that both matters and doesn't matter. I think over the long term, they have very different sort of structural interests going forward in the global environment, right? I mean, first of all, they have a long and ugly history of centuries or millennia of conflict, even race war at various points in time. They say that they're happy with where their borders are right now, but it's
Never
not
really
entirely
are.
clear that's true.
Right.
There are certainly lots of Chinese nationalists these days who look across the border at Primorsky Krai and say, hey, that's the territory that the Russians stole from us through an unequal treaty in the 19th century. So there's some problems there. Structurally, even if you don't care about the history, right, I mean, you've got this enormously long and frankly rather poorly defended border, on one side of which is this resource-abundant treasure trove of Siberia with very few people in it, and on the other side of which is the giant, populous, resource-hungry economy of China. I mean, what could possibly go wrong, right? This is not this is not destined for a long, happy relationship, and I think also in terms of politics and ideology and political agenda, they are both revisionist powers who want to sort of shift around the rest of the world to make it more congenial to what they want to be able to get away with doing.
Yeah.
But their revisionisms are different revisionisms, right? I mean, Russia's objective, at least under the Putin regime, is to become a great power again, to become a superpower second to none, to be able to boast and strut on the international arena as it imagines it did of old and misses being able to do. China's, and it wants to be the dominant power in sort of the Eurasian landmass.
Yeah.
China also has revisionist dreams of global return, but it's global. And the problem is these things don't actually fit very well together over time. Russia's dream of return is incompatible with being second fiddle or third fiddle to anybody.
Yeah.
It wants, its whole point is it wants to be one of the big guys as it used to be.
Yeah.
China's dream of return is incompatible with anybody else being anything but at least second, maybe third or fourth fiddle to China. So because China doesn't like or even understand the concept of separate co-equality. They do not want to be just another equivalent great power. I think they want something more akin to the kind of relative position in the world that they had in their imagining at least, for thousands and thousands of years.
And that we might have had for a decade or two.
Which they bitterly, bitterly resent. And
Yeah.
which they resented in the communist world when it was Moscow that was the big brother to their little
Yeah.
brother, right? So the dreams of revision between Moscow and Beijing are very real and very problematic. And in the short term, they have lots of reasons to cooperate with each other to make life miserable for us and our friends and our partners. But over time, these two visions don't fit with each other.
So Bonnie, I still didn't get a clean answer, though, to my question of how successful this effort is being. Do you have a sense of how successful the sort of the China-Russia tie-up has been at sort of countering American interests, at undermining our ability to influence the world, at undermining our allied relationships? Because looking at Ukraine, at botched, I think that intervention has been, and problematic in my view as it's been. I don't think we've done nearly enough, and nearly fast enough. But it does demonstrate that we've still maintained very strong relationships in Europe. NATO is vibrant. It's aligned. We have we have one new member, and one new member also if Turkey gets its F-16 Vipers. Apparently, we'll see what happens. President Biden, I think, sort of may have inadvertently sort of gave away the story on the deal that's about to be hatched. But talks about whether this is actually being successful. Like, do you see them succeeding in this effort? If so, how successful have they been, and how successfully can they be in the future going forward?
So I think one of the most interesting things about the Ukraine war is how Europe has aligned together, and the strength of the alliance and NATO. The last time and only time NATO was tested was the Gulf, was post 9/11.
Post 9/11, right.
And so if you look at where NATO is today, and if you go to Europe, and I was there 2 weeks ago at a conference, NATO is rock solid, and NATO members are starting to contribute.
They're 2%.
Whatever
getting
it
there.
is, they're getting
I know.
there, and they realize the urgent need to do so.
Yeah.
And there is tremendous gratitude for the United States basically hammering on them and saying, you have to become modern. New Europe, we'll call it Central and Eastern Europe, that's part of NATO now, is taking the lead in all of this. And to see, tiny but mighty Estonia really carrying that NATO flag and forcing the rest of NATO to come to the aid of Ukraine has been extraordinary. So Russia probably miscalculatedly thinking that it could vanquish Ukraine very quickly and NATO would be sort of waking up and yawning and stretching and not even noticing. Russia grossly miscalculated. So the European alliance is strong. China has used all of this sort of Western distraction to really start hammering away at some of our most important alliances in countries like Brazil, in countries like India. I almost want to say forget about South Africa because they have completely left our sphere of influence on many levels. We do have some very good levers that we could use if we wanted to bring them back in. But China has friendship without limits. They've reassured the Russians that they'll be there should Russia come a-callin'. But
will they really, by the way?
Well, this is to Chris's point. I think that Russia will probably not come a-calling unless they're really in desperate need. Because this brings us to your new axis of evil, and they're turning to Iran. That is not a natural fit. Not a natural fit for Russia, which I think they recognize a terrorist regime, an Islamist regime, which could be complicated for them. But rather than depend on China for drone technology, they're turning to a less likely place that can have less control potentially and less influence over their own population, and that they can quash, right? Russia can squash Iran like a bug if Iran kind of rises up and makes Russia feel uncomfortable. This whole landscape, and then we'll bring North Korea into this too, because Kim Jong-un just wants people to pay attention to him. We're lucky, I think, that he hasn't been doing more. Now, Japan might say, lucky?
Yeah.
We think he's doing more than enough. But that's a sleeping lion.
Yeah.
And
They might randomly wake up at any moment and roar.
and it would be random.
Yeah.
Yeah. China, I think, can do a lot to keep the lion in its den.
If it wants to.
If it wants to.
If it wants the lion sort of in its den.
Right.
I think
Yeah.
China is delighted
It's
by the way to which North
Yeah.
Korea distracts and befuddles our strategy in the Indo-Pacific, which is why China has become such a
It's a great cast box.
facilitator for sanctions evasion and providing economic support.
Yeah.
No longer even the pretense of trying to solve things diplomatically.
Yeah. Paul?
2 points I just wanted to make. First, on Chris's comments, and then you asked about, success. So on your comment, I think you were right to point out, this period of time and then the long term. I did
And
say
lots
at
of
the
bad can
outset-
happen before the long term. Don't get me wrong. That's not a sanguine view, right?
Well,
Terrible things can happen before that long term.
I don't disagree. I just wanted to agree with your reinforcement, because at the outset of my comment, I mentioned about historically, the two have not been
Yeah.
aligned. You went further, and thank you, in terms of mentioning the kind of racism, the border conflicts, also just the perception that they have of one another. Russia would loathe to be called a junior partner, which it's often called.
Yeah.
And
China-
which it's becoming
Right.
more and more, right?
Right.
Yeah.
The reality of the situation, the gas station to
Right.
China's.
Right,
A
which
regional power.
McCain used
Yeah.
to always define it as the gas station parading as a country. In any event.
Ouch.
Just like Pakistan, right? A military with the country, right? Yeah.
Don't you remember
No,
that?
that's right.
line?
That's John. That's a
That's
total
what
John McCain line.
he
That's right.
said.
That's exactly right.
So I remember that very well when he said it. So I wanted to align myself with that point about, this doesn't mean that the two of them are going to, that they will have the same kind of mission and purpose that brings them together. Because several sources of friction, and then let me just mention on success.
Yeah.
And friction, Central Asia right now is a main battleground.
Yeah.
The Chinese have been much more successful, the Russians have not. And then also I look at, the Russians have built a base up in the Arctic, and the Chinese wanted to become observers, they are observers. And commercially, this is very key. It's an area of competition. There's been some cooperation, but that doesn't mean that that's really what the direction is. So you're right to point that out. I just wanted to underscore that this is where things are now and what we're dealing with, but that doesn't mean that this is some tight, no limits alliance. Okay. As for success, in this, I would say the interesting thing is before Ukraine and after Ukraine. Let me start with after Ukraine and work backwards. I think that actually Ukraine has had, in certain ways, an impact, but it's a challenging one. What do I mean? Because of the atrocities and just the global community being affected by food supply, by also the major shift in Europe with regard to energy and the need for energy independence. This was a real shift. That was not a success, but that came after actually finally some real directness on the weaponization of energy, because there was a real resistance in Europe to that change. And then so you have those areas, but it's interesting. Take Brazil. Brazil last year, Lula blamed Ukraine for what's happening. This year, by the way, in terms of Brazil's vote in the UN, there's the condemnation of Russia's aggression. So, how I would definitely say that Ukraine, I think, has put them very much on the defensive.
Interesting.
In this case, if you look at it in different sectors, maybe not all sectors, in this case, because when then you look at Take Brazil on its trade. Brazil relies on China for getting its soybean. And in this case, there are certain trade relationships that are not shifting or have not changed. So how successful are they? I would say that they have had some success in terms of their disinformation campaigns. When you look at targeted cases, like in Chile, I'm picking that one out because it's kind of, who's thinking of Chile? The massive protests and demonstrations that took place, that is traced to Russian disinformation, actually, and use of social media. So they have had, in this war of systems, who is providing for whom, they've been having some success internationally, in Latin America and Africa. But at the same time, I have to say that I think that we've been moving forward in fighting back. I think we need to do much more in this area because I think we are really woefully behind on actually getting out our own narrative, and in a way that also there's a strong alliance for it. One last point, because you mentioned Europe. I do want to mention, I think the Indo-Pacific is an important domain. The Quad started in 2007, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. Actually, where it was and where it is now, it definitely, in terms of its level of importance, has been enhanced. It's not only about the military Malabar exercises, but it's also about supply chains, which there's a greater discussion. And I'll conclude on this note, India is an interesting, should I say, partner. It's a democracy, and one which we not only are close to, but we've built our relationship with. But there have been limits. We know that they're dependent on Russia. They've upped their oil imports. And also, Russia is the #1 arms supplier to India.
And has been for a long time.
True, but the Russians have not been able to service. And so I was in India a few months back. There are slow changes.
The border skirmishes has been a problem.
You're asking for, correct, you're asking for, an immediate metric of success. I would use the term, I think it's mixed. I think there are areas where we have come up woefully short. There are other areas like the strength of the alliance, then the Quad and the growth of it. There are areas in which we've been strong.
So I do want the audience, so we will turn to you for questions here in about 5 minutes, so have your questions ready to go. I can go on the rest of the time, by the way, if you don't have questions, but please do have questions. So I do want to turn to one area that's on everybody's mind, particularly up here on the Hill. That's this question of Taiwan, when, if, what it looks like. And the way I want to approach this, though, is as we think about these sort of the sort of relationship that these sort of 4 global repressors have started to put together, how do we see that playing out in a potential Taiwan scenario? And what, if any, impact does the collaboration that we've had with our allies in Europe on Ukraine, does that reflect poorly or positively for us when we look at the Taiwan scenario, or does it not matter? How do we think China sees what we've done in Ukraine? I have a view on it, and my view is that it has not actually helped us, contrary to popular belief, but I'm interested in your all's thoughts.
I think it's been staged. I think in the early stages of the war, China was looking very closely at every single thing that Russia did wrong, taking very copious notes to note,
be ready.
Don't do this, don't do this, don't be like Russia, don't be like Russia. As this war has dragged on, and Xi Jinping has seen really the valiant effort that Ukraine's soldiers have undertaken and taken on themselves, saying, starting with Zelensky, I don't need a plane, I need weapons, but then translating that down to his fighters on the ground.
Who just stood in.
Absolutely. And China sees what it means to fight tooth and nail for your land. And so they're scratching their heads and saying, would Taiwanese soldiers be as willing as Ukrainian soldiers?
I think we're wondering the same thing.
I think we are. I think that we are upping our game in terms of training, in terms of weapons delivery, in terms of preparedness for Taiwan. So that initial stage of, we're just going to watch and we're going to model what to do, what not to do. I think now, the world understands, having lived through these supply chain crises that were driven largely by COVID, by China, and by the chips shortages, the world now understands that if we don't want to go through that again, we need Taiwan. And Taiwan and TSMC are among the most valuable entities on Earth to the global economy.
And does that tell you that our allies would engage in a potential Taiwan conflict?
Engage supportively.
Like send stuff from a distance.
Militarily, it's really, really hard to say. I think that we have some allies who would be all in. And again, it's like those Estonias who really stand for freedom. Would France jump in?
I mean, we saw what President Macron said.
Right. France would capitulate. I mean
that's sort of their nature.
Right.
Just,
it's what they do, and this is so. I think that staged approach. China has seen that it isn't going to be easy. And so a lot of us are predicting that China's going to take a much more measured approach to how it addresses Taiwan, and its attack will probably more likely look like continued economic sabotage, while it simultaneously, while the People's Republic ramps up its own technological capabilities so that it can survive outside the supply chains that we participate in, that Taiwan participates, Japan. They will build up their own domestic industry to such an extent that they're able to operate. I do think we're going to see an element of bifurcation in technology, and that there will be free systems and there will be Chinese systems. And it's like, you go to Europe or you go to Brazil and you have a different plug you need to use. Will there be an adapter that can allow you to operate on either system? Probably some smart engineers will figure that out. But I think economically, we're looking at a bifurcation. If Xi Jinping has publicly announced that he wants the yuan to be the global currency of record and to displace the US dollar, that is effectively that first volley launched in an economic war.
So, Chris, I mean, a lot of people, I think, have this perspective that this Taiwan conflict isn't going to be a hot war, right? They're not going to come across the straits. They may not invade. It might just be a blockade or economic leverage and the like. How likely do you see an actual conflict in the Taiwan theater? What time frame? And if there is one, does the U.S. get involved militarily? The president has said multiple times we will directly. Within minutes, Jake Sullivan or someone from the White House walks it back. So we don't really know what the administration's position is.
He did say it 4 times.
He did say it 4 times in unambiguous terms.
And it is his call.
Right, and it is his call, right? He gets to make that decision. But it would be the first time in a long time the U.S. has made that choice. Without being forced into it. Would we do it? And would our allies, put aside sort of Japan and Australia, who I think are on board with the program, right? The support from the Koreans. Would our European allies come in? And if not, will they send aid, or will they just sort of watch from a distance?
In terms of handicapping what the odds are of any given scenario in Taiwan, I certainly don't rule out an actual honest-to-goodness invasion attempt. They've spent years getting ready for this. They reorganized essentially their entire logistics train and the organization of their armed forces in part to make this kind of combined arms operation more feasible. And just in the last few years, they're buying all the kinds of kit you would imagine one should be buying in order to make that more and more viable as time goes by. I think they're deadly serious about the option. Do they pull the trigger on this? Obviously, I don't know, but I think an actual invasion is very possible, as is as an alternative a blockade, or one segueing into the other. I wouldn't rule out any of those things, and we would be terribly remiss if we were not trying to prepare for all of them. Who plays what role in the event that such a thing occurs? I think the overall message of Ukraine actually supports our efforts to deter a forcible seizure.
Really?
In
That's
the
so
sense,
interesting.
But think of it in terms of
I totally disagree.
But
Yeah.
I know.
I know. Good, we're gonna fight about this.
But think of it in terms
We're gonna bring Paula in first, but we're gonna fight about it for a
Think of
second.
it in terms of counterfactuals.
Yeah.
Had Ukraine February 2022 occurred, and we did what, say, the Obama administration was doing the first time around, namely we sort of like tut and put some inconsequential sanctions on them and say this is a terrible, terrible thing, but we don't actually care enough about it to do anything, right? We wouldn't even provide lethal aid, right? I went on a staff del to Ukraine in 2016 to sort of see how things were going there, and I remember being quite struck by the degree to which, although some NATO folks were stepping in, I think quite creditably, the United States was making a big point of not even helping the Ukrainians with, minor league. I mean, they were begging for javelins, for example. The answer was no. I talked to a colonel who was training Ukrainian troops at Yavoriv, who said that I can train them in how to react if your unit is ambushed by a sniper, but I'm told that I can't train them in how to snipe. Because that's lethal assistance, right? So I mean, we're if we responded as we did before to Ukraine round one, to Ukraine
It'd be
round
worse.
two,
I don't disagree.
what
It'd
would
be
the
worse.
message be vis-a-vis Taiwan?
Fine.
I think the net message here for Xi Jinping is much more, not necessarily completely dissuasive, but it's much more challenging than it was. Turns out it is a bitch to try to invade a plucky little democracy.
Okay,
that
well,
sits
yes,
on your
so they have
border.
learned that lesson. I think Bonn, you agree. They've learned that lesson.
Especially when they get some help from the outside.
Right.
And we're pretty good at that too.
Yeah.
And by the way, Ukraine is a country that we never had a formal relationship with.
Yeah, Taiwan
We did
we've had
not
a
have a
long-standing. That's
Ukraine
right.
Relations
That's
Act.
right.
We did not have
Yeah.
a military defense relationship.
Yeah.
We did not have folks in country in the way that we
That's
training
right.
and
That's right.
engaged.
That's right.
The Ukraine situation is actually, in some sense, you would have imagined it would be a lesser case. So I think the net impact, and by the way, this is not as if, it's not as if the howitzers and the HIMARS and things that are being used up, out of munition stockpiles in Ukraine are ones that would be, we're not sending harpoons and anti-ship stuff.
Right, no, that's right. It's a different conflict. That's
It's
right.
a different
That's
set
right.
of
That's right.
kit
That's right.
and a different
That's right.
set of tactical circumstances. So I actually don't think these are interfering with each other. And if anything, the Ukraine situation is probably in the net, although it's very fraught, probably in the net is helping the credibility of our posture vis-a-vis making Taiwan utterly and dangerously indigestible to the peers.
So Paula, I want to go to you, and then I want to go to the audience for questions. I won't actually get my fight with Chris. We'll do it later. But Paula, thoughts?
Sure. I agree with what Chris just said. So first I'd start
Man,
with
I'm
this.
in the minority.
Does that teach you to invite us?
A bar brawl.
First, I just start with this. One lesson learned is, by the way, when these dictators give speeches, we should pay attention to them in terms of what they say. Putin gave at the Munich Security Conference 2007, he said very clearly, we have a right to invade and help assist any ethnic Russians anywhere, and that, and then Western values are not our values. We're against NATO. I mean, he laid out a number of points. Why do I say this? Xi Jinping has stated very clearly his goal and his intent with regard to Taiwan, and I think we should definitely take heed of that. Number one. Secondly, with regard to Ukraine, I feel very strongly about this. I just went to Ukraine. I just returned on Sunday. I feel very strongly about this I was at the Kiev Security Forum. What happens in Ukraine definitely has ramifications in terms of, in this context, its success or failure as a signal for Beijing in terms of what it can or cannot do. And not just Beijing, I'd say to actually all aggressive dictators worldwide, because they are watching very closely our actions, what we're doing. I think Chris is right to point out, the contrast. In fact, bluntly speaking, with the invasion of 2014, the distinction was we gave no arms when the Ukrainians asked, but there was a second point. The Ukrainians wanted to take on the Russians, and we discouraged them from doing it.
Crazy.
This time they said, no, we are going forward and we're going to go all the way. And so, by the way, one of the reasons why I think Putin felt he could do this now, he calculated, was for that
We would
reason
respond.
of 2014, the precedent.
Yeah.
And then also, bluntly speaking, I think Afghanistan did have
Yeah,
also
the Syria line and
some
Afghanistan withdrawal.
impact.
Yeah, that's right.
But back to the key point about what's happening in Asia, I also think we should take note of what Asian leaders are saying themselves. I did take note that Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, in his speech to the Johns Hopkins University, was very eloquent. He himself made the connection. He said, Ukraine, the war in Ukraine must succeed. We must do everything.
Yeah.
We will be affected. It will send
Yeah.
a signal and give an entree
Yeah.
for an excuse for Beijing to move forward, not only with Taiwan, but just with its overall aggression.
Yeah.
Secondly, I think it's also worth noting how are countries in Asia acting. It is pretty significant, the shift in Japan itself
Yeah.
on defenses.
Yeah.
That is historic, just like some people point out, there's changes in Germany, some of the changes that have taken place, no less Sweden and Finland becoming
Yeah.
members of
Yeah.
NATO. So here we should take note of that, no less Korea, in terms of Korea's position on nuclear and the position that it wants to take.
Yeah.
That's a new wrinkle
Yeah.
here. So simply put, I think there is a connectivity here.
Yeah.
I think it's different in the sense, clearly, as you portrayed, you know, in terms of what happens in Taiwan and how we handle it, the relationships. I think you pointed that out. But my core point is, if we do not succeed in Ukraine, that will have reverberations for the situation for
That's right.
Taiwan.
Small footnote, if I could, though, too,
Yeah.
right? It's not as if NATO has now pulled together in the kind of pretty impressive solidarity that it has, and it is saying, we only care about Ukraine, and by the way, we're now like, we've stopped caring about the Indo-Pacific. Actually, NATO has been more resolute and stronger than in recent, than I remember ever, in its statements about China and about, you know, in effect, deterrence issues in the Indo-Pacific. NATO's
But
getting
see
better.
Macron, right?
Well, there's always going to be something of that, but then looking at what they're doing. Also, I don't really understand why the French president is saying the things that he does. That seems very counterproductive to me. On the other hand, he is in fact deploying French naval assets to the Indo-Pacific on a rotational basis,
true.
along with the Brits, which is not, they view themselves in Paris as an Indo-Pacific nation. Because of some of their residual possessions
Colonial,
there.
right, yeah.
But they take that seriously enough that they're actually
Yeah.
willing to be part of the non-Chinese array of assets, you know, gray hulls underway in
Yeah.
the deep blue out there, in ways that are not at all unhelpful. Quite the contrary, they're very helpful
Stoltenberg
indeed.
has said very directly that China is a threat.
Yeah.
He actually has.
And I wonder if we
also-
would have heard that if
and-
not for Ukraine, interestingly, because NATO
Well,
is now in a different
yeah,
place
in-
in standing up to big bullies
In
than it was
fairness,
before.
in fairness, I'm going to give it in fairness because he had made a statement about China before Ukraine,
Yeah.
and also, interestingly enough, the EU.
Yeah,
Also,
Ursula von der Leyen,
which to
that's
me
right,
was
yes.
even more
Yeah, this is
striking
true.
Yeah,
than
yeah.
actually NATO. One country I do want to mention, because Bonnie mentioned Estonia, Lithuania's got to be definitely down here, given their stand-up, you know.
By the way, I think the Lithuanians were there training the snipers that my American colonel friend
There you go.
wouldn't train, so good for them.
So I promised the audience I go to questions. So I see David and then anybody else. Yep, go ahead. Yep, right there.
As you take the CHIPS Act and other countries, you know, bringing home or nearshoring semiconductor production, how much of support for Taiwan is related to the semiconductor industry versus not? So if 10 years from now we have, you know, U.S. and European semiconductor production less dependency on Taiwan, does that change the dynamic for ally support for Taiwan?
I'm going to respond to that. Yes and no. So a lot of the CHIPS Act and the impetus for it was related to China and understanding that Taiwan is manufacturing the most sophisticated, most advanced chips. They are being designed, not in Taiwan, most of them, designed in the United States, designed in Japan. But the manufacturing of those chips that allow us to do, you know, our smartphones and our smart cars, and increasingly moving into the realm of quantum computing, is all going to be very important to keep Taiwan stable and to keep the manufacturing of TSMC up and running. China, though, is very vigorously stealing intellectual property, stealing chip design, stealing anything that it can, so that it can develop this industry for itself as well. I do think the answer to would we care as much, or is it because of Taiwan's capabilities that we care so much? I think the answer to that is yes, but I also think that Taiwan has begun a PR campaign around the world that it didn't do before. And it has recognized both that it has its own strengths, and that if it doesn't promote those strengths to the world, it will be vulnerable. And so I think we've been helpful to Taiwan in this, in opening doors to talk to countries with whom they don't have official diplomatic relations, to get their story out. I think they're enlisting allies to help get their stories out. They have a lot of friends around the world, if not formal diplomatic relations. So, but it's been an effort, and the Taiwanese elections, I think, will be interesting to watch. If the Kuomintang wins, we're in a very different place. I don't predict that will happen, but what do I know?
Can I push back just a little
Yeah.
bit? I'm not entirely sure. In fact, I think I would argue that we are not helping to prepare Taiwan to defend itself and prepare to help defend it directly, because it has lots of chips. That may add to our interest in the equation, but we cared a lot about Taiwan before TSMC was TSMC, and I think if anything, we might be more willing to engage ourselves in things that could easily have lots of costs and risk in the region if we did not feel that the sky would fall electronically, domestically, for lack of TSMC chips in the event that there were a big conflagration there. My instinct is that we are supporting Taiwan for lots of political and moral and strategic reasons that are not necessarily tied to the chip sector, which may or may not make that more acute, but I think there's a whole lot of there, even if chips were not involved in this factor at all. And I think, if anything, our ability to be less dependent upon TSMC's, being dependent upon TSMC means being dependent upon TSMC being intact.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if there's a serious conflict for Taiwan, there is not
That's
a
probably the
TSMC
source. That's right. That
producing
produces-
sub-nano,
right.
teeny
Right.
tiny nanometer chips, right? That's not going to be a thing.
We
And
might
that-
take it out.
That
We
would
thought
be
China's going to get it.
Yeah. Or they might, Taiwan might.
lots of things one might imagine. And the idea of it making its way through all of that intact is very hard to imagine. So I think the more that we can create a resilient and robust and distributed global ecosystem of producing really high-end chips involving TSMC, right? I mean, if it were up to me, I'd have a whole stack of...
Well, they're building in Arizona, right?
I'd have a
So,
whole
yeah.
stack of green cards with all the TSMC engineers'
Yes.
name
Well,
on
that's
it.
a whole
waiting,
other. Well, that's a
you
whole
know,
other. That's a whole. That, I mean, that
like
immigration.
vacation
That's,
homes
that
in Orlando,
our
like,
immigration
dude, we're
policy,
just,
I think
you
we
know,
all agree, is idiotic.
You know,
Would just-
there needs to be planning for a diaspora here,
Right.
because unfortunately, for better or for worse, it could happen.
Yeah.
And the idea that we don't want all of that human capital and all of that, I mean, it doesn't have to be a diaspora in the United States. It can be in South
We
Korea,
love it
and
here.
Japan, Australia. Love it here. All of the above is a great answer. The key is that we need to be thinking about these things from the perspective of a global network of resiliency that is able to resist pressures and depredations from the PLA.
Would also be nice if we also took our Afghan allies that we made promises to
Love
in as
that,
well. But
yeah.
It would
Yeah.
have been nice.
Yeah, question.
Dr. Ford, how should we have responded earlier this year to Putin's nuclear saber rattling? And second question, in the conversation on Ukraine reconstruction, I know your colleague Thomas Grant has written about the Budapest Memorandum. Should we give nukes back to Ukraine?
And can I add a question in for?
Oh, no.
Oh boy! All right, here we go.
It's a pile-on.
It's going to get good now.
I wanted to hear your comments about Iran and where you see Iran at this time. That would be interesting to hear.
Goodness.
about.
All right, so let me see. I don't want to forget one of these pieces.
Okay.
The first
Sorry.
bit was, remind me?
Well, the last bit was on the, should we give nukes back to Ukraine?
Right, and before that it was,
It was,
I was going to do it in reverse order. Okay, so all right, on nukes in Ukraine, in the short term, no, because I don't think they actually need it. One of the cool things about the Ukraine war is that, the implications for nonproliferation, I think, are truly horrific, right? This is a country that, frankly, they couldn't have used them very well because they didn't have the access codes and things like that, but they did give these things up on the assurances that Russia would guarantee their territorial integrity and we and everybody else would step in to help them if there were a problem. Obviously, that didn't that didn't turn out quite the way that people sort of hoped that it would. Russia flagrantly betrayed those promises, and I think that I worry that the message that will be drawn by folks around the world is like, oh, well, if you ever, first of all, you might need them, and secondly, if you do need them, you shouldn't ever get rid of them, right? And
Well, they look at the Gaddafi example as well, and they say to themselves, I mean, these are two bad examples of giving up nuclear weapons, right? Why would we do it? Why would Iran do it, right?
Yeah, so the
Why would North
message,
Korea do it?
from a non-pro perspective, the messaging is to the future is really worrisome. However, I don't think I think the Ukrainians are doing an extraordinary job of demonstrating that they actually, at the moment, they don't need them. We can help them and they can help themselves and be extraordinarily valiant and creative and clever and dauntless in ways that allow them to accomplish the missions they need to accomplish without nukes. What do I think about Russian nuclear saber rattling?
Yeah, that's right.
Now, it'd be a different game if they actually, blew something up. That would change a lot of things. But in the short term,
You mean with a tactical nuclear weapon?
with a nuclear weapon. Sorry.
Yes, that would change things. I
We're
think
blowing
we
lots
all
of things up already,
see
yes.
that would change things, yes.
But in terms of the saber rattling, I think it's great that their saber rattling is getting them more or less nothing. And I think
Is that really right? I mean, we held off on HIMARS, we held off on
But the saber-
ATACMS,
I don't
we
think
held
we
off
even-
on tanks, we held off on F-16s.
No.
We slow rolled them in.
We've been but that is not due to the saber rattling per se. It is as much due to the existence of their nuclear capabilities as anything, right? Nuclear deterrence. I mean,
There's been a lot of hand wringing
rather
at the
than-
White House.
But too
It's
much.
also the
Too
fear of
much for sure.
escalation.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
The
That's always been their
constant-
fear, right?
that
That's the
constant
entire right.
mantra of
And Putin has been
escalation.
what happens
trying to
with lawyers and-
Putin's been trying to weaponize our nuclear anxieties and our worries about these things, and he's playing. I think he's playing more successfully to the Europeans for a while than to Washington on this. But the bottom line is, even if there hadn't been this really extravagant saber rattling, there would have been an extraordinary amount of hand wringing, just because we have an obvious. There's a non-crazy reason to be concerned about direct conflict with a nuclear-armed power.
But that's also true in the case of China and Taiwan.
It is, absolutely right. And that's the way that nuclear deterrence works. And I think the Ukraine case is fascinating, in part because the nuclear deterrence, even absent the saber rattling, although maybe even more so with it, nuclear deterrence has put something of a box around the Ukraine conflict. And it is, I've heard people occasionally say, we failed to deter Putin invading Ukraine. We didn't use, no one ever tried to use nuclear deterrence to keep Putin from invading Ukraine. In fact, we made a whole point of, they're not a NATO Article 5 country. We didn't let them go down that road. So nuclear deterrence is not an issue. Where nuclear deterrence is actually an issue and is in fact working in Ukraine is on the outside, right? We are very careful not to directly engage in conflict against the Russians because of their nuclear capacities, for the most part. Saber rattling may make it worse, may make it better, but I think it's actually not as relevant as one might imagine it to be. By the same token, there's a reason why Putin is not, I'm sure he'd love to strike those supply depots in Poland or Germany or whatever else it might be, right? That would be fantastic from his perspective. That's his Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Yeah.
He would want to do his Cambodia invasion or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But he's not, right? So I think the nuclear piece has put sort of this
that's
weird
right.
kind of force field around the Ukraine theater in ways that we should remember, because actually it shows that nuclear deterrence works.
So I know we're almost out of time, but you should answer Paula's question on Iran.
That'd be
I know you're trying to avoid it, but so let me get that one in there.
It's on our axis of evil, so.
Yeah.
No, I
It is
think
on the
Iran
axis.
is in some sense the big winner here in all this cooperative stuff. I think there are lots of fraught, challenging issues between Russia and China, lots of bad things they can do together, also some costs, some downsides. I think China's de facto alliance with this sort of imperialist aggressor and territorial annexer and war criminal regime in Moscow is going to come back and bite China in the developing world. They've made lots of hay for decades and decades and decades, going back to the Bandung Conference in 1955, about how Beijing is the champion of the anti-imperialist world, and we're in favor of non-intervention, and then this, okay, we have lots of diplomatic fun to have in messing with their diplomatic strategy in the rest of the world.
Although if you believe Jeffrey Sachs, it is all our fault. Whatever.
May I give a footnote on the Budapest Memorandum?
But Iran's the big,
Okay.
Iran's the big winner here, though, right? So China and Russia is
Okay.
kind of challenging.
Same.
North Korea is its own special weird thing,
Yeah.
and I don't see a lot of uptick in cooperation there, except maybe more Chinese sanctions, evasion support, and economic aid. Iran is the big winner in terms of this cooperative stuff, because the things that kept. And as I said before, the Russians and the Chinese were not selling arms to
And now they
Iran before.
Or they will.
That reticence seems to have gone away.
Yeah.
The Iranians are in a position to leverage these events, I think, probably most successfully of all, relative to their previous, pre-2022 situation. I think the Iranians are best positioned to leverage the current mess that the world is in to their advantage. Then.
It
Paula,
seems like
last
they
comment.
certainly have done that. My last quick comment is just on the Budapest Memorandum. I thought it was regrettable, in my view, what was done, because if you actually have a negotiation and in which four countries did, sign and say that we will protect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine as it gave up nuclear weapons, our own credibility is undermined.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think was very unfortunate in this case. And actually, when you look at what's happening in the global community now, with countries like Japan bolstering its own forces,
Yes.
part of that relates to this issue about credibility.
Yes.
And, our, not just predictability, but credibility. So I just wanted to
Yeah,
register
no,
that in
totally
the
agree.
case of the Budapest Memorandum.
All right, well, we're way
Ukrainians
over.
regret
Yeah,
it.
we're way over time.
Ukrainians
Thank you
regret
so
it.
much to Ambassador Dobriansky, Dr. Ford, Bonnie. Thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.